Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Missouri. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1891, and Missouri's countryside was still healing from the aftershocks of the war that had ended a generation earlier. Many towns were small, stitched together by rail lines and old loyalties. In the region of Montgomery County, amid low hills and shifting mists, a property stood on the edge of farmland and forest. Locals called it the Harlow place, though few dared approach after sunset. Records from that year, property ledgers, birth lists, and church minutes described the land as unremarkable but well kept. Yet, by the end of that summer, the same documents would carry scribbled margins: disturbed graves, unauthorized excavation, unclear intent. The Harlow family had lived there since the 1850s. Brothers Jacob and Samuel Harlow had inherited the property from their late father, a stern veteran of the Confederate militia buried somewhere behind the main house. A young man, Edward, believed to be Jacob's son, lived with them. Witnesses described him as thin as a reed, pale, polite, and often seen walking near the family's private burial ground. Behind their modest farmhouse lay a narrow path lined with dying cedar trees. It ended at a rusting gate where old stones marked the Harlow cemetery. No formal church oversaw it. The inscriptions were fading, some written by hand in iron paint. Neighbors noted that the Harlows tended these graves obsessively, especially at night. A traveling historian, Thomas Calder, arrived in Oakton that spring. He'd been compiling accounts of Civil War-era cemeteries, including the newly founded Confederate Memorial State Historic C.T. in Higginsville, established the same year, 1891, as a home for aging veterans. His research led him toward private burial plots that predated the official cemeteries. That's when he heard whispers about the Harlow brothers. Two men, too fond of the dead, as one tavern keeper put it. Calder wrote in his field notes, "The people of Oakton speak in fragments, in the way the frightened do. They say the Harlows are kind but watchful, that they guard something behind their graves. No law has crossed that fence in years." By June, stories began to surface. Missing livestock, wandering travelers who never reached the next town, and lights that flickered behind the Harlow home long after midnight. The brothers' behavior grew more erratic. They stopped attending Sunday service. Edward was seen in the company of no one. When Mrs. Darlene Pike, the postmistress, asked after him, Jacob only said, "The boy tends what the rest of us won't." No one knew what he meant. The first report filed in the county log described soft earth near one of the Harlow plots. The grave of Eliza Harlow, the brother's mother, appeared freshly turned. The soil was uneven, and pieces of burlap were scattered along the edges. A constable named Marcus Blythe noted it, but took no further action. Disturbing one's own family grave wasn't a crime, not then. But soon, more graves appeared tampered with. Not only Harlow relatives, but neighboring ones too, names like Hendricks and Mason, whose descendants lived miles away. A carpenter repairing the Harlow gate swore he saw Jacob dragging a wooden crate from the earth and covering it with a sheet. When asked what he'd seen, he muttered, "It was shaped wrong for a coffin, but heavy enough for one." The town whispered, but no one confronted them. The Harlows were quiet men, but their land seemed to command a strange respect, or fear, and always, as dusk fell, smoke would rise from the grove behind their house, drifting like incense toward the leaning stones. By late July, the Harlow property had become a boundary line in more ways than one. Farmers who once took the back road past their fields now rode the long way around, even in daylight. The postboy, young Milton Reeves, admitted he left their letters at the gatepost rather than knocking. When asked why, he simply said, "They don't like footsteps behind them." Sheriff Marcus Blythe, uneasy with the rumors but bound by law, filed a brief notice in his ledger. No proof of criminal activity, recommi, observation only. Yet within days, a pair of hunters discovered a series of shallow depressions beyond the Harlow fence. One contained a child's toy horse, its wood swollen and pale from rain. Another depression, freshly filled, gave off a faint scent of ash. These findings reached Calder, who by now had gathered a small collection of notes, sketches, and statements. He tried to interview Edward, finding him alone one afternoon near the cemetery wall. The boy, if one could still call him that at 20, was thin and unsteady, eyes too dark for the daylight. Calder later wrote, his voice trembled as though he feared his own words. He asked whether the soldiers in Higginsville ever dream after burial. When I said no, he laughed softly and replied, "Then ours do." That phrase haunted Calder. The Confederate memorial site in Higginsville had just been established that same year, a place of sanctioned remembrance. Yet here, on private ground, remembrance seemed to twist into something unspoken. The historian began to suspect the Harlows were attempting their own version of preservation, perhaps disturbed by grief or superstition. Locals still remembered the elder Harlow's war years, how he'd lost comrades without burial. Maybe the sons, in their isolation, had built their own ritual of reinterment. Calder's correspondence to the county seat grew more urgent. 3 graves at least. Reopened. Lanterns seen nightly. Fear rising among locals. Possible grave robbery or necromantic belief. His words went unanswered. Bureaucracy moved slower than dread. A blacksmith named Clancy Moore, whose shop sat nearest the Harlow lane, recounted an unsettling night when he heard 3 distinct hammer strikes echo from the direction of the cemetery, followed by a muffled cry. It was no animal, he told his wife. It was someone swallowing their own breath. A week later, a peddler vanished on his route between Oakton and High Ridge. His cart was found empty in a ditch near the Harlow turnoff, wheels still spinning when discovered by dawn patrol. The constable searched the area, but found no trace. Jacob appeared at the sheriff's office days later, calm as ever, offering a crate of produce as if to thank them for their concern. No explanation, no apology. His hands were clean, his clothes pressed. Blythe wrote privately, "That man could look you dead in the eye while standing in an open grave and not flinch." By August, Calder had resolved to see for himself what lay beneath. He persuaded Blythe to accompany him one night, carrying lanterns and shovels. They entered through the north fence under a low moon. The ground was damp and silent. Crickets ceased as they passed the cedars. Behind the mausoleum wall, the earth sagged in a peculiar shape, long and uneven, like a trench filled in haste. Calder pressed his boot to the soil. It gave way. The smell was faint, but unmistakable. Burned cloth, iron, and something earthy, almost sweet. He whispered, "We're too late." Blythe lifted his lantern, the light trembling against stone. There, carved faintly into the back of the mausoleum slab, were initials. E.H. scratched above a date, July 14th, 1891. Beneath it, the outline of a hand pressed into the wet lime before it dried. Human, unmistakable, and small. Calder stared at it for a long while before saying quietly, "That's no grave marker. That's a confession." The men returned at dawn, shaken but silent. No formal report was filed. The sheriff, when questioned later, claimed only that there was nothing left to find worth digging. But the next night, the smoke returned, thicker this time, and rising from 3 points across the Harlow yard. The smoke that rose over the Harlow property in mid-August was described by witnesses as gray at first, then nearly white, as though burning wet linen. Farmers a mile away saw it drift over the trees, holding shape longer than ordinary fire smoke should. When a small search party arrived near dawn, they found no flames, only smoldering soil around the cemetery's edge and the faint smell of oil. Samuel Harlow stood in the doorway of the house, his face streaked with soot, claiming there'd been a lightning strike. The sky had been clear all night. Calder returned the following morning. The brothers had barred the property, nailing planks across the gate. From the road he saw Edward digging near the graves again, pale in the morning light, his sleeves rolled to the elbows. Each strike of his spade was methodical, unhurried. Calder called out once, but the young man didn't look up. He wrote in his notebook that the soil around one grave looked newly arranged, as though something had been removed, not buried. When questioned at the post office later that day, Samuel answered plainly, The ground gives back what doesn't belong. It was the only sentence he spoke to anyone that month. By early September, townsfolk stopped pretending the rumors were just talk. A group of local men, including Clancy Moore and a deacon named Ezra Wilkes, gathered in the tavern to discuss confronting the Harlows. Blythe advised against it, warning that trespass without warrant could bring legal trouble, but the law had become irrelevant to their fear. That same week, a drifter from Kansas City was found dead near the river Bend. No sign of struggle, but his body half buried, his clothes removed, his skin marked by faint scratches. The coroner noted indeterminate handling after death. The site was less than 2 miles from the Harlow fence. Calder's anxiety deepened. In one of his last surviving letters to a colleague in St. Louis, he wrote, "If the reports are true, these men are not simply thieves of the dead. They are keepers of something they dare not name. The air itself turns hollow near their ground." He referenced again the Confederate memorial site in Higginsville, drawing a grim comparison. There, the dead rest under flags in prayer. Here, they are restless and reclaimed. On September 12th, Blythe and 2 deputies rode to the property to make formal inquiry. The door hung open. The interior was cold despite the heat. A pot on the stove had gone to rust. Upstairs, 1 cot remained made. The others were stripped bare. In the corner of the parlor, beneath a loose plank, they found a wooden chest bound with iron. Inside were scraps of paper, fragments of clothing, and a child's porcelain doll. Its face blackened, 1 eye missing. Wrapped among the papers was a ledger of names and dates spanning back 20 years, most of them corresponding to local burials. Several entries bore a strange note beside them. Retrieved. Blythe ordered the papers sent to the courthouse, but they never arrived. The courier wagon overturned on the wet road that night. By morning, the documents were gone. Whether stolen or lost, no one could prove. After that, the Harlow brothers vanished. No trace, no farewell. The farm stood empty, though now and then travelers claimed to see lantern light moving behind the windows at odd hours, as if someone still walked the halls. Edward's name was never recorded again in any census. Only one rumor persisted, that he had taken work under an assumed name at a mortuary in St. Louis, where a clerk once noted his habit of whispering to the bodies before closing the lids. Autumn settled across Montgomery County with a silence that seemed heavier than weather. The Harlow farm, once barely noticed, became a landmark of unease. No one bought the property. The fence leaned inward like ribs caving to the weight of memory, and the graves behind the house grew wild with creeping ivy. For months, Sheriff Blythe avoided speaking of it, but Calder could not let it rest. He revisited the site in late October, hoping to find some closure or at least confirm the brothers were truly gone. The house smelled of earth and mildew. Rats had gnawed through the baseboards. In the cellar, Calder found a small alcove carved into the packed clay wall. Inside, neatly stacked bones, animal at first glance, but one skull too human in shape to ignore. His lantern shook as he examined the arrangement. Rib bones crossed, small vertebrae bound with twine. He wrote later, "I could not decide whether it was the work of superstition or sorrow. Either way, it was deliberate." Upstairs, on a desk coated with dust, he found a letter addressed only to E. The writing was jagged, the ink faded. It read, "If the ground turns again, follow the song. They never sleep. We only borrowed them." Calder folded it carefully, knowing it would never stand as legal evidence, but sensing it was all the truth he'd get. He brought the note to the sheriff, who dismissed it as madness. "Dead men don't sing," Blythe muttered, "and if they did, I'd rather not hear the tune." The press caught scent of the story that winter. A single column appeared in the Jefferson Sentinel. "Family cemetery of notorious recluses yields strange relics." The article was brief, dismissive, almost bored, but it named the Harlows outright, and for the first time, the county's shame became public. Reporters arrived by rail, snapping photographs of the leaning tombs and cracked gates. None stayed long. The soil was so soft, and their boots sank deeper than they liked. One journalist from St. Louis later confessed in a letter, "When I stepped between the graves, I swore I heard breathing. Not mine, not the wind's, but something closer. Winter storms came early that year, sealing the property under a skin of frost. Calder returned to St. Louis, his notes half burned in a hotel fireplace before he left. In the margins of his journal, he scribbled one last thought. If graves can love, they do so without mercy. Decades later, when researchers tried to retrace his work, they found half the records missing, burned in the courthouse fire of 1923. The rest had faded to illegibility. Only one small note in a surviving archive remained legible, written in Blythe's handwriting: 3 men unaccounted for, 1 youth presumed alive, grave plots misnumbered, site unfit for reburial. In the years that followed, the Harlow land became a local caution, used by parents to quiet children, by travelers to mark the turn where they'd light an extra lantern. The Confederate cemetery in Higginsville grew into a formal memorial, its boundaries clean and sanctified. By contrast, the Harlow graves decayed into legend, a darker mirror of remembrance. Some said the brothers had tried to build their own version of that memorial, not of soldiers, but of those they couldn't bear to leave beneath the ground. Others claimed they'd simply gone mad, haunted by the noise of the earth itself shifting beneath their boots. Neither explanation ever settled. By 1893, the Harlow property had already begun to pass into rumor rather than record. Survey maps no longer listed the family's name, though the outline of their land remained like a scar on the county plat. Locals still avoided the trail behind the old cedar line, where the gate to the private graveyard hung loose and crooked. When the wind blew right, it creaked like a sigh. A traveling preacher named Reverend Doss stopped in Oakton that spring, preaching revival under a canvas tent. He warned against the worship of rot and spoke of those who would call the bones from rest. Some thought it an indirect condemnation of the Harlow legacy. Others said he'd visited the property himself before dawn and returned pale, refusing to speak of what he saw. A farmer's boy, curious after hearing the sermon, wandered to the site the following week. He later told his mother he saw footprints pressed deep into the frozen ground, 3 sets of them, one smaller than the rest, leading between the graves and fading at the edge of the woods. When he returned with his father, the prints were gone, erased as if by deliberate hand. The sheriff who'd once investigated, Marcus Blythe, had by then resigned. In a letter to a colleague, he confessed, "Whatever those men were doing, they believed it sacred. I think that's what frightened me most." The only remaining trace of Calder's involvement came in an unpublished paper, discovered decades later among his estate in St. Louis. In it, he reflected on the Higginsville Veterans Cemetery once more, contrasting the peaceful order of its rows with the Harlow grounds chaos, where headstones lean like witnesses too weary to testify. He concluded, "Memory ungoverned becomes obsession. The Harlows mistook devotion for dominion." In the late 1890s, a new family briefly purchased part of the property. The Lewises, a couple and their teenage daughter, and they lasted one harvest. Their journal, later recovered from a trunk in the county archives, describes nights of scratching at the windows and a persistent knocking from beneath the floorboards. The father, George Lewis, noted that the noise came exactly at the hour the church bell from town strikes 12, then stops as if listening. They left abruptly, leaving the house half-furnished. Their wagon was seen heading south toward Arkansas, and no forwarding address was ever found. The property reverted to the county within a year. By then, even those who didn't believe the stories agreed that the place carried bad luck. Fields yielded poorly, fences fell faster than they could be mended, and livestock strayed too near the graveyard only to turn up lame or lost. A few remaining letters from Oakton residents describe how travelers would see lamplight moving among the stones on moonless nights, small circles of glow, never steady, as though held by uncertain hands. When asked, old-timers would only shake their heads. "Maybe the brothers came home," one said. "Or maybe something else did, and it's still waiting for them." In the first decade of the new century, the Harlow story drifted from whispered warning to folklore. What few official records existed had already begun to yellow and crumble. and those who'd lived closest to the events were growing old or gone. Yet strange echoes persisted. A county road worker named Ellis Warren reported uncovering a rusted lantern near the edge of the overgrown path while clearing brush in 1903. Inside it, somehow preserved, was a folded scrap of paper with faint writing. He described the words as barely legible, but one phrase stood out: "The ground breathes with us." The find was dismissed as coincidence, yet Ellis refused to return to that section of the road afterward. That same year, a group of students from Columbia College came to Oakton on a rural folklore survey. They interviewed locals about old war legends and burial customs. Their notes mentioned the Harlow place briefly under the heading Unverified Accounts of Grave Watchers. One informant, a woman identified only as Monsieur Pike, told them the younger one, Edward, wasn't cruel, just lost, said he could hear what the earth whispered after rain. Another man, possibly a descendant of Sheriff Blythe, claimed his uncle had once seen faces like candlelight flickering across the gravestones from the woods. None of these accounts made it into the students' published paper. Decades later, the handwritten drafts were found among their belongings, margins stained with water and dirt. The Harlow legend might have ended there, filed away as superstition, had not the Higginsville Veterans Cemetery expanded around 1911. During excavation for a new wing of the grounds, workers unearthed a small chest containing fragments of bone, cloth, and a rusted spoon engraved with the initials E.H. The find was quietly catalogued and stored in the site's archives. The superintendent, unsure of its origin, assumed it to be a mislaid relic from a family plot transferred from elsewhere in the state. But a local historian, Mrs. Clara Boone, later connected it to the Harlow name after reading Calder's surviving notes. In a 1914 journal entry she wrote, "If indeed this spoon belonged to Edward Harlow, then part of him reached the same year's soil as the Confederate dead. Perhaps he sought peace among those who also would not rest." Her paper was largely ignored, though it resurfaced in the 1940s when a regional historian revisited the Oakton files. By then, the Harlow property was gone, reclaimed by forest and thistle. The only visible sign of habitation was a crumbling stone wall, half swallowed by vines. Children dared each other to touch it and swear they felt the hum of air beneath, like distant breath through hollow ground. One local woman, born decades after the brothers' disappearance, would later tell a radio interviewer, "You could always tell when you were near it. The birds went quiet and the trees leaned closer, as if listening to something you couldn't." By the 1920s, the Harlow story had become a cautionary fireside tale, something told in low tones on winter nights, half believed, half feared. The Great War had changed what people thought about death, and the notion of disturbed graves no longer carried quite the same sting. Yet in Oakton, the name still held weight. Local children avoided the cedar path, even though the gate had long since fallen, and the graves themselves were barely visible beneath the brush. In 1923, the courthouse fire erased many of the county's earliest documents, including those that might have shed light on the Harlow's deeds. Afterward, all that remained were oral accounts. One came from a widower named Josiah Bell, who claimed to have worked on the property as a boy. He remembered Edward not as a villain, but as a quiet sort, sickly maybe, always talking to the ground like it could answer back. Bell's testimony appeared in a small-town newsletter decades later, printed beside an advertisement for a local fair. It was treated more as curiosity than evidence. Still, his description aligned eerily with earlier notes from Thomas Calder. Calder himself, by then long dead, was remembered as an eccentric historian obsessed with burial rituals. His surviving notebooks, housed in a St. Louis archive, included marginalia about both the Harlow family and the Confederate Memorial State Historic Site in Higginsville. In one entry he mused, "Every nation builds monuments to the fallen. The Harlows built theirs beneath the soil, where only the worms could read the names." That same decade, a pair of university students from Kansas City visited Oakton to document haunted grounds of the Midwest. They spent one night camping near the overgrown cemetery. In their report, found years later among forgotten papers, they described hearing faint tapping as of iron striking stone and a dim yellow light moving among the trees. At dawn, they found small depressions in the soil, circular and perfectly even, as if something round had been pressed there and lifted away. Their sketches show nothing definitive, but one included a shape faintly resembling a human hand. Locals scoffed, but after that, no one camped there again. In 1929, when the county considered clearing the forest to extend the road, the project halted abruptly. The surveyors reported their compasses malfunctioning and their horses refusing to enter the clearing. One man, a foreman named Grant Nichols, insisted he saw 3 figures near the old wall just before dusk, 2 tall, 1 smaller, standing still and watching. When he blinked, they were gone. His crew refused to return, and the county quietly moved the road elsewhere. Over time, Oakton dwindled. The population shifted toward the rail towns. The Harlow site, left untouched, became one of those places you could point to on a map, but never actually visit. Yet every few years someone claimed to see movement among the cedars or hear faint voices when the fog rolled in. "Not ghosts," one local preacher said, "just memory. Memory that doesn't know how to die." By the mid-1930s, the land where the Harlows once lived was almost unrecognizable. Saplings had become towering trees, the foundation of the house reduced to moss-covered stone. Only the cemetery wall still marked the outline of the family plot. An old man named Walter Raines, who worked with the county land office, attempted to trace ownership after a tax dispute. His notes from 1936 list the property as abandoned, lineage unverified, cemetery active, by reputation only. That last phrase, active by reputation, would later be underlined by an archivist reviewing his files, though no one could say what Raines had meant. Around that same year, a Works Progress Administration team visited the area to survey rural landmarks of potential historical value. Their photographer, Ada Hollis, took 3 glass negatives of the site. 2 survived. In the first, the crumbling fence appears ordinary, but in the second, there is an unexplained haze just above the graves, an indistinct figure-like blur that modern analysts attribute to light leakage. Yet Hollis, in a letter to her sister, insisted she saw someone standing where the headstones meet the trees, too still for breath. The negatives were quietly filed away, labeled Cemetery, Oakton Township, circa 1890s, 1900s. During that period, newspapers began reviving regional legends to fill slow news cycles. The Missouri Courier printed a brief piece titled The Brothers Who Guarded the Dead. It summarized the tale as local superstition, mentioning how 3 generations had claimed to see figures near the graves on foggy nights. The article quoted a single surviving relative, a woman named Ellen Harlow of Fulton, who denied any family connection but added, "Whatever those men did, they did it for love, not for profit." Her words reignited curiosity. Folklorists from the University of Missouri began collecting new testimonies, some with wars, dry, inconsistent. One man claimed to have found a silver button in the soil marked with military insignia. Another spoke of a hollow under the hill that breathes like a bellows. Most of these accounts were dismissed as invention, but a few details remained consistent: the number 3, the scent of smoke, and the sense of being watched. In 1939, a letter arrived at the county office from an unknown sender, postmarked Kansas City. It contained only a single sentence: "Tell them the graves are settled now." The handwriting bore faint similarity to Edward Harlow's known letters from 50 years earlier. Handwriting analysts could not confirm, but neither could they rule it out. The note was placed in a file and forgotten until decades later when a historian rediscovered it while compiling a history of Missouri folklore. By then, the story had drifted far from its origins, yet each generation found a way to retell it, as if the silence of the graves demanded new voices to speak. And through it all, the comparison lingered. The ordered rows of the Confederate Memorial Cemetery in Higginsville, where soldiers rested in consecrated ground, and the wild, tangled soil of Oakton, where the Harlow's devotion had blurred into something unholy, something unfinished. When the 1940s arrived, America was again consumed by war, and the old legends of Missouri's backwoods were momentarily forgotten. But history, it seems, waits patiently beneath the soil. In 1947, after a heavy season of storms, part of the Harlow Cemetery's north embankment collapsed into a shallow ravine. A hunter from nearby Bellflower discovered fragments of bone and rotted wood scattered across the washout. Assuming it animal remains, he gathered a few for inspection, but when the county coroner examined them, he quietly noted, "These are not from beasts." The discovery prompted a short-lived investigation that never reached official record. The coroner's assistant later told a journalist that his superior ordered the remains reburied to prevent disturbance. No graves were marked. Around this time, an aging professor named Lydia Boone, who'd studied folk burial rites, published a paper titled Devotion to the Dead, The Border Between Faith and Madness. In it, she referenced the Harlow case as a regional example of ritualized remembrance misinterpreted as crime. Her tone was sympathetic, not condemning. "The evidence suggests intent toward preservation," she wrote, as though these men sought to safeguard their kin from the corruption of time. The academic world largely ignored her, but in Missouri, her work stirred unease. People who'd grown up hearing stories of the brothers didn't like being told they were simply misunderstood mourners. For them, the fear was not in what the Harlows meant to do, but in what they might have succeeded in doing. In the fall of that year, a local paper printed a curious piece titled The Unearthed Ledger. A construction worker clearing brush along the Oakton Ridge claimed to have found a sealed tin box containing a water-damaged notebook. Inside were sketches, crude outlines of human forms, arrows pointing to places labeled B. Allow the cedar and the well behind the gate. The sheriff at the time, descendant of Marcus Blythe, dismissed it as forgery, yet refused to release the contents publicly. Rumor claimed a single line repeated through the pages, "We are three, and we are waiting." Meanwhile, hikers began to visit the area for thrill-seeking, inspired by the growing fascination with ghost stories and post-war mystery magazines. One group reported hearing what they described as shallow breathing when they approached the ruins. Another claimed they found a rusted oil lamp still standing upright beside the graves, its glass unbroken despite decades of weather. Whether coincidence or fabrication, such accounts multiplied. In 1949, a letter appeared in the Missouri Folklore Review signed only E.H., the same initials that had haunted Calder's notes, the grave inscription, the spoon unearthed at Higginsville decades earlier. It contained just one sentence, "You buried the wrong ones." The editor printed it as a curiosity, unaware of its connection. But in Oakton, where the fields had long since turned to forest, those few who still remembered said the air grew heavier that autumn. A hunter swore that when he passed near the cemetery one morning, he saw a man standing among the cedars, thin, coatless, and staring toward the horizon. When he looked again, the figure was gone, but the frost where it had stood remained unmelted long after sunrise. By the early 1950s, Oakton itself had nearly vanished. Only a few homesteads remained, their occupants older, weary, and uninterested in the ghosts of the past. Yet, in historical circles, the Harlow legend found renewed life. Dr. Lydia Boone, now in her 70s, delivered a lecture at the University of Missouri titled Burial and Belief in Postbellum Missouri. She spoke calmly, as if trying to diffuse decades of superstition. "What we fear in these tales," she said, "isn't evil. It's devotion unrestrained by order." Her inclusion of the Harlow brothers as an example caused murmurs in the audience. Some whispered that she had once visited the Oakton grounds herself, walking the line between graves until dusk. Her private notes, later found among her estate, confirmed this. She wrote, "No sound but the wind through cedar, yet once I thought I heard humming beneath the soil, faint as a human breath." Outside the halls of academia, the legend grew more lurid. Pulp magazines featured the Graveyard Lovers of Missouri as a Gothic curiosity, inventing details that never existed, murders, hauntings, even secret cults. The truth, buried under embellishment, only became harder to find. Meanwhile, local workers clearing a section of forest road near the property uncovered a collapsed brick tunnel. It extended several feet before caving in completely. At its entrance lay two rusted tools, a shovel and a lantern bearing the initials S.H. The discovery never made national news, but it reached Boone, who annotated a newspaper clipping. Samuel Harlow, remnant found. The following spring, a photographer named Daniel Clegg attempted to document the site for a small historical journal. His surviving prints show overgrown earth, crooked stones, and one peculiar image, a faint outline behind the trees, pale against the dark brush. Clegg insisted he saw no one when he took it. His assistant, and quit the project afterward, claiming he'd heard footsteps circling us but never closing in. In 1955, the state erected a marker a mile from the site noting Oakton Settlement, 1850–1895. No mention of the Harlows, though locals called it the Warning Stone. Those few who tended nearby farms told stories of hearing faint knocks on their windows during thunderstorms, always 3 times, never more. One farmer claimed that after the third knock, he found muddy prints leading from his porch toward the woods, small at first, then growing larger until they vanished in the grass. That summer, a group of Boy Scouts hiking through the area became lost in the fog. When found, they reported seeing an old house without walls and a man in rags watching from the graves. Searchers found no structure, only the foundations of the long-collapsed Harlow home, and beside it, a section of earth still blackened from old fire. One of the boys later told his mother that while they waited to be found, they heard whispering behind them that stopped whenever they turned. The sheriff dismissed it as imagination, but the mothers of Oakton forbade their children from hiking there again. That same year, the local newspaper reprinted Boone's earlier writings on the case. Her closing words echoed like a benediction and a warning. The Harlows remind us that remembrance without rest becomes a haunting, even if no spirits remain. As the decades turned, the Harlow legend refused to decay. In the 1960s, Missouri entered a new age of documentation, oral history projects, regional archives, and the birth of public radio folklore programs. With it came a renewed interest in forgotten mysteries, and once again, the Harlows returned to print. A journalist named Harold Gentry produced a short radio feature titled The Silent Cemetery of Oakton. The broadcast opened with field recordings of wind and insects, layered beneath Gentry's calm narration. They say no birds sing there after dusk, that the ground is still breathing, that the brothers who tended it never really left. It aired only once, but drew dozens of letters from listeners claiming family ties or first-hand encounters. One woman wrote that her grandfather used to deliver supplies to the Harlow farm before their disappearance, and swore that the boy, Edward, never aged like the others. His hair stayed black, his face too pale. My grandfather said he felt watched, even in daylight. Another listener, a farmer near Wellsville, claimed to have found a fragment of an iron cross embedded in his plowshare, engraved with faint letters, H-L-O-W. He sent it to the station, but it was misplaced in transit. Gentry later published an essay about the experience, admitting that though he'd begun the project as a skeptic, something about Oakton unsettled him deeply. "It isn't ghosts," he wrote. "It's memory that refuses to lie still. A century is long enough for the living to forget, but perhaps not for the earth." The State Historical Society briefly considered designating the site as heritage terrain, but the proposal died in committee after a landslide destroyed part of the northern ridge in 1964. When workers cleared debris, they reported finding sections of brick and ironwork buried in the slide, too structured to be natural. Among them, one piece of Coro. Dead iron bore 3 initials carved in a shaky hand, JHSH and EH. The find reignited speculation that the brothers might have constructed something subterranean before their disappearance. A geologist who examined the site claimed to detect hollow resonance beneath several points of the earth, suggesting chambers or tunnels. Excavation was never approved. Funding and interest both evaporated when state surveyors called the soil unstable. Yet rumors persisted that one night, after the team withdrew, Locals saw lights moving within the trees, faint and yellow, like lanterns underground. During this time, a new generation of researchers began comparing the Harlow case to broader patterns of regional folklore. A professor of sociology wrote, "It mirrors the function of sacred spaces, where grief becomes ritual and ritual becomes myth." He drew parallels to the Confederate Memorial State Historic Site, noting how both represented an obsession with the dead, one sanctioned, one forbidden. He concluded that the Harlow story, like all enduring legends, exists because it fills the silence where truth was buried. By 1969, Oakton itself was a ghost town in all but name. The roads had faded into gravel tracks, and only a handful of weathered barns remained. Teenagers from nearby towns treated the Harlow site as a dare, an initiation for the brave or foolish. They'd go at night, shout into the darkness, and run back laughing. Most came home with nothing but the thrill of fear, but one boy named Leonard Price returned pale and trembling. He said he'd seen a man standing by the graves, coat torn, face hidden, holding what looked like a lantern. "He didn't move," Leonard whispered later. "He just waited, like he knew we'd come." In the 1970s, with urban legends becoming a staple of paperback collections, The Graveyard Lovers of Missouri appeared in a cheaply printed anthology under the heading True Tales of the Haunted Heartland. The author, a writer of pulp thrillers, embellished freely, introducing blood rites, curses, and spectral soldiers. Yet even in his exaggerations, he preserved certain details with uncanny accuracy: 3 figures, a private cemetery, and a sense of ritual rather than random violence. This blurred line between folklore and history only deepened the mystery. Meanwhile, a group of amateur archaeologists from Columbia tried to survey the property with ground-penetrating rods and hand trowels. They found nothing but scattered pottery shards and rusted nails, until one volunteer unearthed a section of brick laid in a deliberate arc, like the rim of a tunnel entrance now sealed with earth. Before they could probe further, a sudden rainstorm turned the soil to mud and forced them to abandon the site. They never returned. One of the volunteers later wrote in a letter to the editor of a local newspaper, "The strangest thing was the smell. Not rot, not damp, something like candle wax and iron." That same decade, state workers repairing a bridge near Higginsville uncovered a small crate lodged in the riverbank. Inside were pieces of weathered wood and a tarnished locket containing a daguerreotype portrait of 3 men and a younger one standing together. The faces were blurred by moisture, but the clothing and backdrop resembled descriptions of the Harlow family and their graveyard. No one could confirm its authenticity, and the find was quietly stored in the state archive. A researcher who examined it privately noted that the young man appeared no older than 20, despite the brothers' disappearance decades earlier. Some speculated it was merely a family resemblance. Others, whispered about something else. Through it all, the comparison to the Confederate Memorial State Historic Site persisted. Articles in regional history magazines contrasted the manicured rows of Higginsville with the wild decay of Oakton, asking whether both sites reflected 2 sides of the same impulse, the urge to keep the dead close. A folklorist named David Kane concluded in a 1978 essay, "We may never know what the Harlows intended, but their legend endures because it frames our own unease about how remembrance can blur into possession." By the end of the decade, the Harlow land was officially listed as no access, after a hiker fell into a hidden sinkhole and had to be rescued. He later told rescuers he'd heard a man's voice calling his name from below, even though no one was there. His statement was never filed formally, but circulated among locals as one more unsettling echo. After that, even thrill-seekers began to stay away. Only researchers and the occasional drifter ventured near, leaving little behind but footprints and sometimes new stories of being watched by unseen eyes among the stones. By the early 1980s, the legend of the Harlow family had evolved into something between history and haunting, a narrative that locals didn't quite believe, yet couldn't dismiss. Television crews from Kansas City and St. Louis arrived to film Halloween specials, setting up bright lights along the cedar path and pretending to shiver for the camera. The segments aired once and were quickly forgotten, but among the crew there were quiet admissions that something about the place felt wrongly quiet, as one sound technician phrased it. The microphones picked up faint, rhythmic vibrations, low, pulsing hums that didn't match the wind or the natural acoustics of the woods. The engineers erased them from the final broadcast, but kept the reels locked away afterward. Around that time, the Missouri Historical Quarterly published a brief update referencing new archival finds. Among them was a partial transcription from a damaged 1891 county letter, the one sent by Thomas Calder before his disappearance. Only fragments remained, but a single line stood out. "They are not gone. They have only gone beneath." The article drew little attention outside academic circles, yet for those who knew the story, it sounded less metaphorical than warning. In 1984, a small group of folklore students camped near the site as part of a research project. Their advisor, Dr. Helen Rousset, later summarized their field notes. The first night was uneventful, except for a faint smell of burnt cedar near the graves. The second night, one student reported hearing whispering in cadence with his heartbeat. On the third night, they all awoke to find shallow impressions in the soil surrounding their tent, 3 on each side, spaced evenly, as if placed there deliberately. Rousset's report concluded that environmental conditions could account for most observations, though she noted a pervasive sense of presence that none of the students could explain. The findings were never formally published, yet copies circulated among university folklore departments, reigniting debate about whether the Harlow case represented mass hysteria or something older. In Oakton, the land remained unclaimed. County officials discussed converting the area into a conservation plot, but the proposal stalled after surveyors again reported equipment malfunctions. Compasses spun, readings vanished from field sensors, and one crew chief described hearing a noise like wind trapped in a bottle that persisted even when the air was still. By then, locals had stopped calling it the Harlow place. They simply called it the Hollow. Visitors reported feeling watched, as if the trees themselves leaned closer. Some nights, truck drivers on the nearby road swore they saw light flicker briefly beyond the tree line, a glow too steady to be fire, too dim to be headlights. One driver described it as 3 lanterns, swaying slow, like someone searching for their way home. By the 1990s, the Hollow had become a minor destination for amateur ghost hunters armed with camcorders and cassette recorders. They came in groups of 3 or 4, laughing at first, their flashlights cutting through the overgrown brush. Few stayed long. Most footage returned empty, but one recording made in 1993 circulated quietly among enthusiasts. The camera pans toward the collapsed cemetery gate, and for a moment, the audio catches a faint metallic tapping, 3 sharp sounds, evenly spaced. The operator whispers, "Did you hear that?" before the tape cuts to static. The full recording was later analyzed by sound technicians at a local university who determined the noise came from an indeterminate metallic source at close range. None could explain the echo that followed, like breath drawn through stone. That same year, a historian named Margaret Ellison published Bound to the Earth, Folklore and Burial in Missouri. One chapter revisited the Harlow story as an example of obsessive memorial culture, again drawing parallels to the Confederate Memorial State Historic Site. She wrote, "Where Higginsville embodies organized remembrance, Oakton reflects its shadow, the impulse to preserve not for honor, but for fear of forgetting." Ellison's inclusion of Calder's 1891 phrase, "They have only gone beneath," reignited academic debate. Some scholars suggested the Harlows might have constructed underground chambers as crude catacombs. Others believed it symbolic, a metaphor for the way grief burrows into families. When Ellison visited the site herself in 1995, she reported nothing unusual, until weeks later when she sent a follow-up letter to a colleague. "I can't explain it," she wrote. "I went back to my car and found soil on the back seat. It smelled like smoke." She never returned. In 1997, a county restoration crew clearing a nearby trail uncovered fragments of car, Ved limestone roughly 200 yards from the known graveyard boundary. The markings were faint but legible, 3 initials, JH, SH, EH, and beneath them, the words, "Still tending." The find drew local media for a week before the stones were quietly moved to storage. Their current location is uncertain. Around that same time, property assessors noted the ground near the hollow was unusually soft, as though something hollowed beneath. Tests for sinkholes came back inconclusive. Surveyor Daniel Morrell later described hearing a steady thud beneath his boots, distant, rhythmic, as though someone striking from below. He refused to continue and transferred assignments. In Oakton, few old residents remained, but those who did spoke softly when asked about the legend. An elderly woman named Ruth Pike, great-granddaughter of the midwife Mary Els, told a reporter, "My grandmother said the boy came to her door once, long after they said he was gone. He didn't ask for food or water. He asked if graves can forgive." Ruth's voice trembled, but her words were firm. She said she told him no. The ground remembers everything. By the turn of the millennium, the hollow was more myth than map, a place whispered about in local diners but rarely visited. The woods had grown dense, the paths erased by decades of neglect. Yet curiosity, like the past, never really dies. In 2001, a graduate student named Patrick Morrow undertook a thesis project comparing Missouri's rural folklore to verifiable historical records. He included the Harlow case as a test of how fact becomes legend. His fieldwork took him deep into Oakton's remains, accompanied only by a handheld recorder. Morrow's audio logs, later archived at his university, reveal a shift in tone, from detached analysis to quiet unease. The first entry is clinical. Site located, GPS unstable, ground uneven, gravestones mostly destroyed. The second, recorded 2 days later, changes. I can hear something faint. 3 knocks, spaced evenly, from beneath the slope. The final recording ends abruptly with a breath and a single whispered phrase. "They're still here." Morrow returned safely, but refused to speak of what he'd found. His written thesis omitted the field recordings entirely, concluding instead that the persistence of the Harlow narrative demonstrates the durability of grief when untethered from ritual. Years later, he admitted privately to a colleague that he'd left an offering, a small bouquet of cedar sprigs, on what he believed was the youngest Harlow's grave. The colleague recalled him saying, "It wasn't fear, it was pity." Around the same time, satellite mapping first captured the area in high resolution. Analysts reviewing the images noticed irregular indentations forming a triangular pattern behind the cemetery wall, consistent with subsurface collapse. The shape was too geometric to be natural. Geological reports described the soil as compacted in layered strata, almost as if the ground had been repeatedly disturbed and refilled. A journalist for the St. Louis Dispatch pursued the lead, writing a feature titled "The Men Who Wouldn't Let Go." The article wove together local oral history, Calder's letters, Boone's academic writings, and Ellison's research. It concluded with a haunting observation. 110 years after the first spade struck the Harlow soil, the same earth still breathes, shifting as though stirred from below. The piece drew public attention briefly, sparking online debates between skeptics and believers. A local television crew visited for a follow-up segment, but left before sundown when their equipment failed repeatedly. The audio technician reported a persistent hum in his headphones that matched the rhythm of a heartbeat. The footage they captured showed only trees and mist, except for one frame, where 3 faint points of light appear in a straight line, hovering near the ground. Analysts later blamed lens reflection. Still, the cameraman quit his job within a week, telling co-workers, "There were shadows moving between those lights, and they moved like they knew we were watching." In the 2010s, the Hollow reappeared in the digital age as a viral curiosity. Paranormal forums shared grainy photos of moss-covered stones and alleged lantern lights drifting between trees. Amateur historians uploaded scans of Calder's surviving notes, Boone's lecture transcripts, and Ellison's annotated articles. Threads debated whether the Harlows were grave robbers, grief-stricken preservationists, or simply characters in a long-running hoax. Yet scattered among the speculation were posts from hikers who'd ventured near the site and returned unsettled. One described hearing low murmurs, like voices in the next room, except there was no room. Another wrote of finding a small spoon engraved with an E lying atop a stone, warm to the touch despite the cold ground. In 2013, a documentary team began filming a series on America's forgotten cemeteries. They secured permission to shoot near Oakton and spent 3 nights on the edge of the overgrown plot. Their cameras captured nothing but mist and shifting branches until the final dawn, when one operator noticed impressions in the dew, 3 sets of footprints converging at the center of the cemetery and vanishing into the soil. The footage was never broadcast. The production company cited technical issues. Privately, one crew member told a friend he'd seen a figure standing by the cedars, coat torn, head lowered, holding a lantern at knee height. He said it didn't move even when the wind bent the trees. Around this time, a small academic press published Memory Beneath the Soil, a collection of essays revisiting the Harlow case as a study in cultural obsession with the dead. One contributor drew an even sharper contrast with the Confederate Memorial State Historic Site at Higginsville, noting how both were founded in 1891 but diverged into opposite symbols, one of ordered remembrance, the other of disordered longing. Higginsville sanctified memory, she wrote. Oakton devoured it. The book received modest attention but reignited field visits by folklore students, some leaving offerings at the stones. Locals disliked this, saying the disturbances brought activity back. By 2017, county drones mapping woodland for fire risk recorded unusual temperature differentials beneath the soil near the cemetery wall, 3 distinct cold spots aligned in a triangle. The report, filed quietly with the county, drew no public notice until a freelance journalist obtained it under an open records request. His subsequent article ended with a chilling quote from an unnamed surveyor. It felt like standing on the lid of a chest someone was knocking from inside. By the early 2020s, the Hollow had slipped once more into that strange borderland between folklore and fieldwork. The site remained technically county property, but unmarked on public maps. Even so, curiosity crept back through online forums, and amateur researchers determined to locate the real graves. Satellite coordinates were traded privately, and those who visited posted shaky nighttime videos filled with static and whispers that might have been wind. In 2021, a pair of urban explorers entered the area during heavy fog. Their footage, later uploaded anonymously, showed only fragments, crooked headstones, fallen branches, and a flicker of light deep in the trees. One voice in the background whispered, "There are 3," followed by a noise like soft digging. The video ends with the camera tumbling to the ground and recording for several silent minutes. Authorities found the explorers unharmed but shaken. One refused to speak about what they saw. The other only said, "It wasn't ghosts. It was waiting." That same year, a team of historians from Jefferson City began cataloging forgotten cemeteries for a digital archive. When their drone flew over Oakton, its compass glitched briefly before stabilizing. Reviewing the footage, they noticed a geometric depression, 3 shallow hollows forming a perfect triangle. A tree had grown at its center, its roots twisting through what appeared to be an old foundation. When they returned a week later, the tree had fallen. Beneath the uprooted trunk lay a fragment of stone etched with 3 initials barely visible under moss: JHSHEH. The historians documented the find but made no public statement. Within months, a local podcast devoted an episode to the graveyard lovers of Missouri. The host read passages from Calder's notes, Boone's reflections, and Ellison's observations, ending with her own words. Maybe the story persists because no one ever closed the ground. Listeners flooded the comments with speculation, some calling it fabrication, others claiming strange experiences after visiting. One man from Montgomery County wrote, "I went out there last fall. It's quiet, too quiet. The air feels thick, like the soil's holding its breath." Another claimed he'd seen a dim light moving between the stones, stopping every few steps, as if searching. By now, the legend had stretched beyond its borders, shared in threads and documentaries. A living echo passed from voice to voice. Yet amid the noise, one truth endured. No official record ever declared the Harlows dead, nor confirmed their burial. The family line simply dissolved into the soil. The final entry in the county's 19th century register remains the same. 3 names, unmarked graves, and beside them a note penned in faded ink, plots unverified, keep undisturbed. And so the story lingers, neither solved nor forgotten, just suspended in the dim space between record and rumor. The Harlow land remains untouched, a patch of tangled earth surrounded by cedar and thorn, where the grass grows uneven and the air feels heavier than the wind can explain. County records still list it as non-viable terrain. Yet every few years, someone reports seeing the glow of 3 faint lights drifting among the trees before vanishing near the old boundary wall. Modern hikers who pass close say their phones lose signal, their watches pause, and the forest grows too still, as if holding its own breath. The few who venture farther claim to hear knocking from the ground, 3 slow taps, then silence. Those who've studied the legend the longest note how that pattern repeats through every generation. The 3 brothers, the 3 initials, the 3 lights, the 3 knocks. Perhaps coincidence, perhaps something that endured even when the family did not. In academic circles, the Harlow mystery endures as a cautionary example of devotion unmoored from faith. Calder's letters remain a quiet testament to reason's failure against grief. Boone's writings on ritual and madness are still cited, and Ellison's contrast between the wild decay of Oakton and the solemn order of the Confederate Memorial State Historic Site in Higginsville continues to anchor the story in historical context. But for those who live near Montgomery County, none of that matters. They know the story differently. To them, the Harlow ground is not history, it is presence. They say that on still nights the cedars sway without wind, and that if you whisper a name near the old fence, something whispers it back, a sound like the turning of soil, a sigh that feels too close. And when dawn comes, the mist settles low across the field, erasing every footprint, but leaving the faint scent of smoke and iron in the air. The land waits, as it always has, as if time itself agreed to keep the brothers' secret. And maybe that's all it ever wanted, to be left undisturbed. Yet the Hollow doesn't forget. Its silence is not peace, but patience, and those who pass too near swear they hear, beneath the cedars, the soft rhythm of earth tapping back. 3 times, and never more.